Maria believed she was saving her husband's life. Every decision she made in those terrifying days was born from a fierce, protective love and a desperate desire to shield him from a world that had proven to be cruel and unforgiving. She never could have imagined that her greatest mistake, a simple, age-old folk remedy passed down from her grandmother, would become his only hope for survival. Their story began not with malice or neglect, but with a simple, devastating reality. In their world, getting hurt was a luxury they could not afford. Her husband, David, was a man built of resilience and quiet pride. A construction worker by trade, his body was a roadmap of his labor, calloused hands, a network of faded scars, and muscles hardened by years of hauling, lifting, and building. He was the kind of man who treated pain as an old, familiar acquaintance, something to be endured, not complained about. Their life together was a delicate balancing act, live paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment that felt more like a temporary shelter than a home. They had love, but they had no safety net. No insurance, no savings, just the daily, grinding hope that nothing would ever go wrong. That hope was shattered on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. David was on a demolition site, pulling down the frame of an old warehouse. A rusted piece of rebar, hidden within a crumbling concrete wall, snagged the back of his shirt as he turned. He felt a sharp, tearing sensation across his back, a pain so intense it stole his breath. Looking over his shoulder was impossible, but he knew it was bad. He finished his shift, the wound a hot, searing fire against his spine. His pride and fear of losing a day's pay overriding the instinct to seek immediate help. When he walked through their apartment door that evening, Maria knew something was wrong instantly. The way he held himself, stiff and unnatural, the pained exhaustion in his eyes that went beyond his usual weariness. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. He tried to brush it off. "Just pulled something, I'll be fine." But she persisted, her intuition screaming that this was more than a pulled muscle. She gently lifted the back of his sweat-soaked t-shirt, and a horrified gasp escaped her lips. A deep, ragged laceration, at least 6 inches long, ran diagonally across the thick muscle of his lower back, perilously close to his spine. The wound was raw and dirty, filled with dust and grit from the demolition site. "David, my God, we have to go to the emergency room now," she said, her voice trembling. But he just shook his head, the stubborn set of his jaw one she knew all too well. "And then what, Maria? They'll put in a few stitches and hand us a bill for $5,000? 6? A bill that will ruin us? We'll be paying it off for the rest of our lives." "No, we'll handle it. You can handle it." His words were a desperate plea, a statement of trust in her that was both a comfort and a terrible burden. She knew he was right about the cost. A single visit to the ER could send them into a spiral of debt from which they might never recover. The fear of that financial ruin was, in that moment, more tangible and immediate than the fear of infection. So, Maria made a fateful decision. She would become his nurse. She drew on the half-forgotten wisdom of her grandmother, a woman who had raised a family with herbal remedies and unwavering faith. She remembered the stories of how honey, raw and pure, could heal the most stubborn of wounds. In their small kitchen, she created a poultice, a ritual of desperate hope. She gently cleaned the gash as best she could with antiseptic, her hands shaking as David gritted his teeth in silence. Then, she took a jar of dark, unfiltered honey and slathered it thickly over the wound, covering it with a clean compress made from a torn bedsheet. It was an act of profound love and profound fear. For the first 48 hours, it seemed like their gamble had paid off. The initial, searing pain subsided into a dull, manageable ache. The swelling around the edges of the wound didn't seem to get any worse. They held each other close at night, whispering reassurances, congratulating themselves on their resourcefulness, on having dodged a financial bullet. But on the morning of the third day, the illusion of healing shattered. David woke in a cold sweat, his body trembling with a low-grade fever. The pain had returned with a vengeance, a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to emanate from the bone itself. A strange, sickly sweet smell now clung to the bandage, an odor that was no longer the clean scent of honey, but something cloying and foul, the unmistakable stench of decay. With a growing sense of dread, Maria knew that her attempt to save him had gone horribly, terrifyingly wrong. Asterisk panic began to set in, a cold, creeping vine that wrapped itself around Maria's heart. The folk remedy, her one shield against a devastating hospital bill, had not only failed but seemed to have made things worse. The foul odor emanating from David's back was now a constant, terrifying presence in their small apartment, a grim reminder of her failure. When she changed the dressing, the sight beneath made her stomach churn. The edges of the wound, once clean and red, were now tinged with a sickly, grayish-yellow color, and the surrounding skin was swollen and hot to the touch, a dark red that spread outwards like a poisonous tide. David's fever climbed steadily, leaving him in a state of shivering misery, his usual stoic silence broken by low groans of pain. He was getting weaker, and she was getting more desperate. She clung to her chosen path with the ferocity of a gambler convinced the next hand would be a winner. She doubled down on her efforts, her fear manifesting as a flurry of frantic activity. She spent the little money they had on more honey, this time a more expensive, medicinal grade she found at a health food store. She boiled herbs, creating pungent concoctions to wash the wound, her actions driven by a desperate hope that she had simply used the wrong ingredients, that a purer form of her remedy would reverse the damage. Each time she tended to him, she would put on a brave face, her voice a calm, soothing balm intended to mask the terror she felt. "It just needs a little more time, baby," she would whisper, her hands trembling as she applied a fresh poultice over the festering gash. "The infection is just fighting back. We are stronger." But they were not stronger. The infection was a relentless, unseen enemy, and it was winning. By the 5th day, David was barely lucid. The fever had taken hold, plunging him into a hazy, nightmarish world of delirium. He would murmur incoherently, his eyes unfocused, occasionally crying out in his sleep. He could no longer stand on his own, and the simple act of getting him to the bathroom was an exhausting, agonizing ordeal for them both. The wound on his back was now a horrifying landscape of decay. The flesh had taken on a dark, almost black appearance, and the smell was so overpowering that Maria had to stuff a towel under their bedroom door to keep it from consuming the entire apartment. Yet, even in her terror, the thought of the hospital bill remained a paralyzing force, a monster just as terrifying as the infection itself. She felt trapped between two impossible, catastrophic outcomes. It was David's breathing that finally broke her will. His breaths became shallow and rapid, a desperate, rattling gasp for air that signaled his body was beginning to shut down. His skin was slick with a cold, clammy sweat, and his lips had a faint, bluish tinge. Maria looked at the man she loved, this strong, proud man who had been reduced to a fragile, gasping shell, and the wall of her denial was instantly obliterated. The fear of debt, of financial ruin, of losing their apartment, it all evaporated, rendered utterly insignificant by the immediate, overwhelming terror of losing him. What good was a life without debt if it was a life without him? The realization crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless with the clarity of her own foolishness. With a sob of pure, unadulterated panic, she grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling with the keypad, barely able to see the numbers through her tears. When the 911 dispatcher answered, Maria's voice was a choked, hysterical torrent of words. "My husband. He can't breathe. His back, there's a wound. He's burning up. Please, you have to hurry. Please, I think he's dying. I think I'm killing him." The last words were a confession, a release of the guilt that had been poisoning her for days. She had tried to be his savior, to protect him from one kind of ruin, and in doing so, she had delivered him to the brink of another, far more final one. The wail of the approaching siren was no longer a sound of financial dread, but the sound of her last, desperate hope. She sank to the floor beside her husband's bed, her hand clutching his, whispering apologies he could no longer hear, her entire world shrinking to the agonizingly long seconds between each of his shallow, rattling breaths. The paramedics moved with a speed and efficiency that seemed to bend time itself. The moment they burst through the apartment door, the small, private world of David and Maria's suffering was over, replaced by the detached, systematic protocol of emergency medicine. One medic immediately went to David, his hands a blur of motion as he assessed his breathing, checked his pulse, and clipped a sensor to his finger. The other paramedic turned to Maria, his calm, steady questions cutting through her hysterical sobs. "Ma'am, what happened? How long has he been like this? What did you put on the wound?" Through a torrent of guilt-ridden tears, she confessed everything. The construction accident, the fear of the bill, the honey. The paramedic's face remained an unreadable mask of professionalism. But she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not judgment, but a deep, somber understanding of the tragedy unfolding before him. The journey to the hospital was a surreal, jarring nightmare. Maria sat huddled in the corner of the ambulance, watching as the two strangers worked tirelessly to keep her husband alive. They inserted a large bore 4 into his arm, pushing bags of saline to combat the septic shock that was causing his blood pressure to plummet. They spoke in a rapid-fire language of numbers and acronyms she couldn't comprehend. BP is 80/50. SATs are dropping to 89. Tachycardic at 130. Each cryptic phrase felt like another nail in a coffin she had built with her own loving hands. The rhythmic beeping of the machines was a frantic, artificial heartbeat that had replaced the steady, familiar rhythm of the man she loved. She watched the city lights streak past the window, a world that was moving on, completely oblivious to the fact that hers was ending. The emergency room was a blast of organized chaos. A team was waiting, and the moment the ambulance bay doors flew open, David was taken from her. He was no longer her husband. He was a GCS-9 septic with a large, unvisualized dorsal wound. Doctors and nurses surrounded his gurney, a whirlwind of blue scrubs and focused, determined faces. Maria was gently but firmly guided to a small, plastic chair in the waiting area, suddenly an outsider to the most important event of her life. The minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. Every time a door opened, her head would snap up, her heart pounding with a sickening mixture of hope and terror. Finally, a doctor emerged. He was older, with tired, compassionate eyes and a grin set to his mouth. He introduced himself as Dr. Albright. He led her to a small, private consultation room, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the news was bad. "Maria," he began, his voice gentle but direct. "David is in very critical condition. He's in advanced septic shock, which means the infection from his wound has spread throughout his entire body and his organs are beginning to fail. We're giving him the strongest antibiotics we have and medication to support his blood pressure, but he is not stable." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "We had to cut away the dressing you applied. I need you to prepare yourself. The wound it's one of the most severe I've seen. There is extensive tissue necrosis. That means the flesh is dead and dying. That is the source of the systemic infection." Maria could only nod, tears streaming down her face. But the doctor wasn't finished. "The location is what concerns me the most," he continued, his tone becoming even more grave. "The wound is directly over his lumbar spine. An infection this deep, this aggressive, and this close to the spinal column is a 5-alarm fire. If the bacteria have penetrated the deeper tissue layers and reached the spinal canal, we're looking at a spinal epidural abscess or bacterial meningitis. The pressure from the swelling alone could be causing irreversible nerve damage." He looked at her directly, his eyes full of a heavy, sorrowful pity. "Maria, right now, the infection isn't just threatening his life. It's threatening to paralyze him." The word paralyze struck her with a physical force. It was a fate worse than death in her mind, a living prison for the strong, capable man she loved. Dr. Albright explained that they had to act immediately. They were taking David to a specialized procedure room to perform an emergency surgical debridement. They had to cut away every last piece of the dead, infected tissue in a desperate attempt to get ahead of the infection and relieve the catastrophic pressure on his spine. As he spoke, a nurse appeared at the door, a silent summons. It was time. Maria was allowed a brief moment to see David before they took him. He was a pale, unconscious figure, a landscape of tubes and wires, barely recognizable as her husband. She kissed his cold, clammy forehead, whispering, "I'm so sorry," over and over again. Then, they wheeled him away, leaving her alone in the cold, sterile hallway, to wait and pray, completely unaware that the nightmare hidden within her husband's wound was even more shocking and complex than the doctors could ever imagine. The procedure room was a stark, cold world of sterile steel and focused, blue-gowned figures. David lay face down on the operating table, a solitary island of flesh under the intense, unforgiving glare of the surgical lights. Dr. Albright stood over him, the familiar weight of the scalpel in his hand feeling different this time. This wasn't a clean, controlled excision. This was a desperate salvage operation, a battle against a raging, uncontrolled infection on the most delicate of terrains. The goal was not elegance, but speed and brutal efficiency. He had to cut away the dead flesh, get down to healthy, bleeding tissue, and pray to God the infection hadn't already breached the final, fragile barrier protecting the spinal cord. Every member of his team knew the stakes. A single slip, a single pocket of missed infection, could mean the difference between David walking again and spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair. With a deep breath, Dr. Albright made the first cut. The scalpel sank into the blackened, leathery edge of the wound. There was no bleeding, only the soft, yielding resistance of dead tissue. He worked with a grim determination, excising large sections of the necrotic flesh, which the assisting nurse removed with forceps. The air in the room, already thick with the smell of antiseptic, was now contaminated with the foul, sweet stench of gangrenous decay. For the first 10 minutes, the procedure was a textbook debridement of a neglected wound. The surface layers were a landscape of biological ruin, a testament to the ferocity of the infection. The team worked in a tense, focused silence, the only sounds the snipping of surgical scissors and the soft clatter of instruments on the metal tray. But as Dr. Albright carved deeper, moving from the outer edges toward the critical area over the spine, he began to notice anomalies. The expected pockets of liquefied pus were absent. The deeper he went, the less active infection he found. The tissue beneath the top layer of black eschar wasn't the soupy, gray mess he anticipated. It was strangely firm and almost clean. A deep furrow formed between his eyebrows. This didn't make sense. An infection this severe on the surface should have created a festering, septic cavity deep within. He exchanged a puzzled look with his resident, who could only shrug in response. He continued to cut, driven by a growing sense of unease, the feeling that he was about to uncover something far outside the realm of his experience. He excised one final, large piece of dead tissue from the very center of the wound, the area directly over the lumbar spine. He lifted it away, and the entire surgical team froze. A collective, audible gasp echoed in the silent room. One of the younger nurses instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her masked mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The cavity beneath was not filled with pus or rotting muscle. It was a writhing, living mass. Hundreds of pale, white larvae were pulsating in a coordinated, hypnotic rhythm, burrowing through the remaining necrotic tissue with a horrifying efficiency. The wound was infested. It was a sight of primal, visceral revulsion, a scene from a nightmare that had burst into the sterile reality of their operating room. For a long, stunned moment, nobody moved. The sight was a violation of everything their medical training had taught them. But Dr. Albright, after the initial shockwave of disgust passed through him, forced himself to look past the horror and see the clinical reality. His mind, a vast library of medical knowledge, began flipping through forgotten pages, through obscure case studies and articles on battlefield medicine. He leaned in, his eyes narrowed, and his initial revulsion began to morph into a staggering, electrifying sense of awe. He saw that the larvae were not attacking the healthy tissue. He could see the clean, pinkish-red line of demarcation where their work stopped. The base of the wound, the critical area over the spinal fascia that he had been so terrified of reaching, was immaculate. It was covered in healthy granulation tissue, the bumpy, ruby-red sign of a wound that is actively, beautifully healing. A breathless, almost giddy laugh escaped his lips, a sound so out of place it made the others stare at him as if he'd lost his mind. "My God," he whispered, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on disbelief. "Do you see it? They're not the infection. They're the cure." He looked up at his stunned team, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. Her remedy. The honey. It's highly antibacterial on the surface, but it's also a sugar. It stopped the surface bacteria from spreading, but it couldn't stop the deep tissue from dying. And that sweet, decaying tissue became the most perfect, irresistible beacon for blowflies. He pointed with his forceps into the living, writhing mass. These larvae have performed a perfect microsurgical debridement. They followed the path of necrosis with a precision I could never match. They cleaned this wound down to the millimeter, right to the edge of the healthy tissue, and they stopped. They ate the infection. They ate the dead flesh that would have caused the spinal abscess. He looked at his team, the full, miraculous weight of the situation dawning on him. She thought her mistake was killing him. But that mistake is the only reason he isn't going to be paralyzed. These things, they saved his life. Star. The surreal, holy terror atmosphere in the procedure room gave way to a state of profound, focused respect. Dr. Albright, now a man possessed by a sense of medical wonder, completely altered his surgical plan. "We are not debriding," he announced to his team, his voice low and steady. "We are completing a process. These creatures have done the impossible. Our job is now to assist, not to destroy." The objective shifted from a desperate, aggressive excision to a delicate, meticulous cleaning. Using a gentle, low-pressure saline irrigation system, they began the bizarre task of respectfully evicting the hundreds of tiny, biological surgeons. The team worked with a newfound reverence, carefully flushing the larvae from the pristine wound bed they had so perfectly prepared. As the last of the larvae were washed away, what remained was a sight that would be forever seared into the minds of everyone present. The base of the wound was a landscape of healthy, pink granulation tissue, a perfect foundation for healing, completely free of the necrotic, infected tissue that had threatened to kill David only an hour before. It was a miracle, born of a horrifying infestation. The conversation Dr. Albright had with Maria in the cold, sterile quiet of the consultation room was the most difficult and strangest of his long career. He found her curled in a plastic chair, her face pale and streaked with dried tears, the very picture of a woman bracing for the worst news of her life. He sat down opposite her and began with the only two facts that mattered. "Maria," he said, his voice soft but clear. "He's alive, and he's not paralyzed. He is going to walk again." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A choked, ragged sob escaped her lips, not of grief, but of a relief so immense and so violent it threatened to tear her apart. For a full minute, she could only weep, her body shaking with the release of days of accumulated terror. When she could finally look at him, her eyes full of tearful, questioning gratitude, he took a deep breath. "Maria, what happened in that operating room is something I will be studying for the rest of my life," he began. "Your husband's wound was severe, and the infection was deep. By all rights, the pressure should have caused permanent spinal damage. But it didn't." He leaned forward, choosing his words with immense care. "The remedy you used, the honey, it was a mistake, a dangerous one under normal circumstances. But in this specific case, that mistake initiated a chain of events that is almost unbelievable. The honey's antibacterial properties likely slowed the surface infection, but its sweetness, combined with the decaying tissue beneath, attracted blowflies." Maria's face fell, the guilt returning. "Oh God," she whispered. "I brought bugs to him." "Yes," Dr. Albright confirmed, holding up a hand. "But you have to listen to me. The larvae that hatched in his wound, they didn't spread the infection. They consumed it. They ate every last particle of dead and dying tissue with a precision that no surgeon on earth could replicate. And in doing so, they created a natural drainage system that continuously relieved the pressure on his spinal cord." "Maria," he said, looking her directly in the eye, his voice filled with absolute conviction, "your mistake didn't almost kill him. It is the only reason he is alive and will not be paralyzed. You inadvertently initiated a perfect, life-saving medical procedure." The torrent of information was too much to process. Honey, flies, larvae, a cure born from filth. Maria stared at him, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile her devastating guilt with the doctor's impossible, miraculous words. The thing she believed was her greatest failure had been his salvation. David woke up 2 days later, weak, disoriented, but alive. His first, hazy memory was of Maria's hand clutching his, her face a landscape of tearful relief. His first conscious action was to test the limits of his own body. He felt a deep, aching soreness in his back, but when he focused his will, he could wiggle his toes. He could bend his knees. A wave of overwhelming gratitude washed over him. so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. He had been given a second chance. When Maria and Dr. Albright later recounted the full, grotesque, and incredible story of his rescue, he listened in stunned silence. The tough, proud construction worker, who had been too stubborn to seek help, had been saved by the most repulsive creatures imaginable. The experience was profoundly humbling, stripping away his pride and leaving only a raw, unvarnished appreciation for the life he had almost thrown away. The months that followed were a journey of healing, both physically and emotionally. The hospital, fascinated by his unprecedented case, helped them navigate a maze of financial assistance programs, lifting the crushing weight of the bill that had started the whole ordeal. The wound on David's back healed beautifully, leaving behind a long, pale scar that he would carry for the rest of his life. It was a permanent reminder not of an injury, but of a miracle. He and Maria were changed. The fear that had once ruled their lives was replaced by a deep, shared resilience. They had faced the abyss and had been pulled back by the most unlikely of saviors. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would trace the scar through his shirt, and she would take his hand, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They understood now that love could make you do desperate, foolish things, but that sometimes, in the strange, terrifying calculus of the universe, those foolish things could lead to the most extraordinary grace.